This just in, they're printing houses now. Don't get excited, this video isn't from the future, and no, this isn't the premise of a potential sci-fi film either. They're doing it for real. Now, we know that the word printing suggests that they're made using your workaday printer, but it's a little more complicated than that. If you'd like to find out how, stick around, since today we're explaining how 3D printed houses are built. For starters, what are 3D printed houses? This one is kind of a no-brainer. A 3D printed house is, of course, a house that's A, either built using 3D printing techniques, or B, with the help of 3D printed materials. Before we proceed, it's important for you to understand that 3D printing is nothing like regular printing. Simply put, a full-blown house doesn't roll out at the push of a button. If that were the case, we would have solved homelessness in under a week. A 3D house, instead, comes together in pretty much the same way as dental implants or a jet. So to speak, a large 3D printer extrudes a paste-like concrete through a nozzle layer by layer to build them. Think hot glue gun, but on a larger scale and much more robust as well. Or a piping bag and the layers of a cake. Speaking of hot glue, while concrete best lends itself to this technique, it's used for a range of materials like planks and plastics as well. Now, there are two main ways in which 3D printing takes place. Let's check them out. Next, how are they made? Like traditional buildings, a 3D house also begins with a digital design. After they've chalked out the design, architects have to determine which parts of the house can be 3D printed. This usually includes foundations and walls. Once that's done and dusted, the instructions are fed into a robotic printer. This printer is then either transported to the construction site or produces the required materials in a factory. In the second case, the materials are then transported and assembled manually. Now, as we said before, there are two ways of going about this technique. Robotic arm extruder. To begin with, companies can use a printer with a robotic arm extruder. It's pretty similar to a tabletop 3D printer with a robotic arm. The only differences being that it extrudes concrete instead of thermoplastics, and is bigger in size. Yes, if you haven't figured it out yet, both of them work on almost the same principle. To elaborate, the arm uses a method called contour crafting, meaning that it moves around on rails, usually on multiple planes, and prints the house layer by layer. This technique, that is contour crafting, is relatively new and was first spearheaded by Dr. Baruch Koshnevis at the University of California. Sand 3D printing. The second one is referred to as sand 3D printing. As its name implies, instead of concrete or other substances, it utilizes sand-like materials, including silica, ceramics, or even small metal particles. The average size of these said particles is around 140 to 200 micrometers. Now, similar to the first method, the machine begins with a single layer. The layer is then bound using a binding jetting. This jetting is made up of a polymer glue and, as we've explained, binds these sandy particles to give them the required 3D shape. It's pretty much the same as an inkjet printer. However, instead of transferring ink onto paper, it transfers a binding agent onto sand. And get this, just like an inkjet printer, it can also print in color. As a result, architects can now make a number of custom pieces via this technique, which otherwise would require ages to build or find. If you were wondering, this technology was developed in the 1990s by a German company and in the US at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. After that, how much do they cost? With techniques out of the way, we can finally begin to answer the important questions, i.e., is a 3D printed house affordable? Well, the answer to this question isn't that simple. To elaborate, things like the area that it's located in, the housing market, the homes surrounding it, etc., will of course have to be factored into the price. In itself, however, the price actually depends on just how much of it has been 3D printed. A rather simple structure, for instance, would cost as little as $5,000. A more lavish house, on the other hand, would understandably cost more. From what we've gathered, their prices are relatively the same as a conventional house. Sometimes, if you're thinking completely out of the box, they can be a tad more expensive than a regular house. Speaking of, and as we've pointed out before, when 3D printing, you can't completely get rid of traditional construction methods. In order to finish the house, you'll have to pay for normal construction as well. This explains why they're still on the expensive side. Like, come on, you weren't expecting the printer to install your wiring, right? Anyway, the only scenario in which they're cheaper is if you're building them yourself, or as we we said, if you're looking for a rather small space, a 2-bedroom for example. If not, then get ready to foot a hefty bill. More importantly, how long do they last? Now, if you're paying an arm and a leg for something, you'd want it to last a lifetime. So can these structures do that? Well, believe it or not, the ones that haven't been built to be biodegradable can last up to 60 to 70 years. This is all thanks to the different mixtures that various construction companies use and swear by. Besides good old concrete, they also have a number of polymers in them. But here's what we need to keep in mind. Houses aren't all concrete. Timber is also an equally important component, one which is highly susceptible to decay if not taken care of properly. If you think about it, this reasoning kind of extends to the house as a whole. Simply put, much like a traditional house, it'll last as long as it's well maintained. Additionally, what are the pros of a 3D printed house? We know what you're thinking. If the costs and durability aren't any different, then why not just build a regular house? Well, there are multiple reasons for that. To begin with, 3D printed houses require much less time. From what we've gathered, they can be built in under 8 days. For perspective, a regular house requires anywhere between 6 and 8 months to finish. Think about it. With no need for manually mixing, building, and transporting the materials, not only is there a 40 to 50% reduction in the construction's time frame, but also it lessens the need for a large labor force. This brings us to our second advantage. That is, you don't need a lot of people on the construction site. From what we know, it takes as little as 3 people to monitor or control a 3D printer. This, in turn, helps reduce the chances of construction site accidents. We know they'll have to be called in for the assembly eventually, but according to surveys, most accidents happen during the construction and not the assembly of a building. Speaking of construction, 3D printing is way more material efficient than conventional methods as well. There are literally no offcuts. Apart from creating close to no material waste, it also utilizes reduced energy as compared to a conventional project. Finally, 3D printing allows designers to think out of the box. They can create a bunch of creative designs, which, mainly owing to the cost, are outright impossible in a conventional situation. Take those funky curved walls for example. They take so much time to perfect manually. Owing to all of these benefits, it makes perfect sense why investors are more interested in investing in 3D printing nowadays. Not just investors, even the government is looking into them in order to curb the homelessness problem. Lastly, are there any downsides to them? You know what they say, every street has its puddle. Now, when it comes to 3D printing houses, the puddle is mainly that you can't build the whole thing. To add to that, since this technique builds things layer by layer, it lacks the smooth finish typical of a regular house, meaning that unless you're paying extra bucks to have the house sanded down, it'll have a rather rough exterior. This mention of extra bucks reminds us that 3D printing, since it's a novelty that not many companies are experienced in, might cause the cost of your dream house to balloon up. To add to that, because of their novelty, there's a big question mark on their structural integrity as well. To elaborate, while companies claim that they can last for years on end, not enough tests have been conducted to confirm these claims or issue proper building codes for them, which is why several municipalities don't allow them. And even though we just pointed it out as a benefit, there's no denying that it pushes laborers out of work. Since the machine handles pretty much everything, there's no need for contractors to hire on-site manual workers. This is, of course, bad news, especially with the state of the economy. That's a wrap for this video. Provided you have the money, would you opt for this technique? If not, then why? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.